quite a bit. All right, so introduction to Active Directory, the domain services. So we're going to get, and we've talked about this some, the Active Directory domain service, ADDS. What is a domain controller? Installing a domain controller. Okay, so we'll get into domains, organizational units, forests, the schema, which we'll touch at some of it. You really don't have to worry about. Again, we're changing our hat. If you're talking an organization with tens of thousands of people, you may need to get into the schema. For the most part, most of the people are never going to need to touch it. What's new for the Active Directory in 12, as well as R2, and we're dealing with R2. Yeah, not a lot, but you will have a few. Basically, yeah, and we'll get to that because there's really the one type of question you'll see we'll address. C3PO? R2? Yeah, you just saw R2 right there. Or what's the R4 or whatever the... Okay, so we talked about it Monday. There are some parts that are difficult for us to understand because we have, right, you have your physical structure. You've got your buildings, right, and you're going to have them connected together. And then within that, you're going to have your logical part, right? And how do those two, they almost always overlap, but a lot of people have a difficult time thinking of the logical when there's a physical piece in front of them. So in our case, we are going to have, right, our physical server, and that's a physical thing. Whether it's a laptop, whether it's an actual blade, whatever it is, that is a physical element. And if you want to compare the two, you can say the logical would be more like the software running on a physical box. Okay, and there's a lot of things that are going on that are much more logical based as opposed to the physical itself. So when we talk about logical, we have our physical box, and within that we are going to have partitions. That's the logical part. Now, what happens if I have two hard drives installed? That's a physical thing. When you deal with backup options, what does striping mean? Or, yeah. Okay, so in that case, I've got two physical disks, and I'm literally, as I'm saving data, I'm using it on two physical disks. And if I have a 100 gig and a 100 gig, the user is going to see what? A 200 gig. So physically, I've got 200s, but logically, there's a tool in there that's making it act as a single piece. So when we get into the Active Directory, we've got our partitions. So we've got, and they're all done automatically. They're built into Active Directory when you install it on the domain controller. What is, if you do know, what is the schema? Okay, what is a scheme? General Webster's term. If you're scheming something. Okay, there's a plan. There's your scheming to me sounds more kind of, yeah, more almost kind of yeah, or I was going to say spy thriller type thing. But in this case, if we have a user, so if I'm going to create, let's say whether it's a domain user, so I'm going to create a user. And when I create that user account, what are the options that I have for that user? Can I give that user a last name? Okay? No, just what are some of the options? So you create a new user, first name. Okay.
And you can pick what the domain is at, blah, 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 at whatever.
Address, phone numbers, all sorts of different pieces. Now, when you create Active Directory, Greg, do you have to go through and say, I want to create a user, and I want user 1 to only have a first name? No, you get 50, 60, 70 different options, and you can adjust them accordingly. So the schema is all of that pre-built into Active Directory. So the way we use the schema is just the end result, which is I create a new user, I can give it a username, a login, I can define the first name, last name, address, the groups, all those, what department they're in, what is their position, what is their extension. Those are all parts of the schema. Now, those are also the only parts of the schema that we can visually see. There are hundreds and hundreds of other schema attributes that are hidden that we can go through and change or add if we want to. Now, how often do we have to do that? Hardly ever. When would you do that? If you have 50,000 people in your company, and maybe you're in a different country where there's a particular element or attribute that nobody really uses. So for the most part, the schema is never going to have to be addressed or handled. On the test, the way they're going to bring up the question is dealing with the schema and how, if you have users that need additional attributes associated with that object type, how are you going to do that? And you're going to have to go in and change the schema. So we've got the schema. What is the difference between your domain, trees, forests? What is a domain forest? Okay. Does it have to be multiple domains? No. It can be at least one or many. Here's the trick question. Go ahead.
Forest is kind of like a hierarchical, one step above domain.
Typically associated with a naming standard. What is a FQDN? FQDN. Fully qualified domain name. Okay. So, if we were to go back pre-2000, mid-90s with NT4, there was a particular option that was really cool. It's called networking. And there's another part of networking with NT that says, I am going to create a domain, N, and in the old NT world, what was our limitation for objects? More. Roughly, I was just curious, it was kind of one of those trivial pursuit questions. So in old pre-2000, you could have a limitation of 40,000 objects.
That's everything. That's user account, computer.
Thank you. So I could have users, computers, groups.
Contacts, whatever.
Okay, now, so how big of a company would easily chew up 40,000 objects? Easily. HP by far. Albertsons, Intel. Okay, so what is their problem? If the old domain has a limitation of 40,000 things, and you have some people that have 3 or 4 computers, so now you have one person, right? So you theoretically have one person that could equal 15 different objects. Correct. This is when early NT in that first domain. So if you created one domain called intel.com privately, that first domain had a limitation of 40,000 objects, which isn't a lot. Somebody say, oh, 40,000. Well, if you have one person with 15 objects, you're talking what, 15, 18, oh, not even that, you're talking 3,000, 4,000 people could very easily chew up. Well, 1,000 people would chew up, yeah, easily. So what was your solution? Would Intel say, you know what, for us to create a domain, I need to fire 60,000 people so that I can fit it into this structure? I guess that was option one, which nobody wanted. So what was your other option in the old days? Okay, so I would create additional domains. Could I have an intel.com and an intel.com internally? No, it's the same. So what did we used to have to do? We would have Intel, and that would be the first one created on our internal network, an Active Directory. And that's the same today. The first one that we create is going to be our schema master. It also is going to be the root, right? A lot of times we'll hear root, whether Linux and other things. And when we're talking the root, that is going to be the first one installed. And so if our limitation as a comparable element was 40,000, how would we then divide it? We would maybe go by, let's do the 50 states. So we would have Intel.Idaho.California, Indiana, so forth, so forth. So now you're suddenly saying, oh, okay, each state has a limitation of 40,000. So yeah, I'm doing better. Wait, we got California. California's got, 15 big campuses. We've got 20,000 people there. So now what we would do is say, so we would have Intel, which then went to Intel.ca, which then went to Intel.ca.la, San Francisco. So we would have to break it down accordingly. And that's how you would get the structure. And what was the main reason for doing these domains and subdomains? Manage. Can somebody down in here automatically go to the top? No. Somebody up here can go down. It's a top level structure. If you're allowed up here, then you can go down lower. If you're at the bottom, you can't necessarily go all the way up. What's that? Not by default, but you can allow that. You can. But in the old days, earlier structure, no. You had to make that change intentionally. Okay? And so that's the reason why a lot of individuals came up with this logical structure. I've got North America, north, south, east, west, and then you break it down accordingly. Now, one reason was because the numbers had to do it. I wasn't going to fire 3/4 of the company to make it fit into just Intel. So how is that different than nowadays? Well, now, ever since Windows 2000, when we install I'm just going to stick with the Intel. We'll say Intel.local. Now when we do Intel in Active Directory, we're still going to install the first one. It's still going to be our forest. But now we're talking 2 billion plus objects that can be created. So do we still have the same problem? How so? Are you going to use up 2 billion objects? Probably not. Okay, compare 40,000 to 2 billion. So basically that problem is not the main issue. So why, if I can have 2 billion objects in this Active Directory domain, why would James say, you know what, Gary, yeah, that's great, it works, but I still want a .ca. I still want a .idaho. Okay. Ease of administration, when you're deploying policy and other pieces like that. And a lot of times when we're dealing with this, he's also associating it what? With a physical boundary.
I'm also assuming that maybe California, Idaho have their own
Mhm.
servers, so I wouldn't want to put this on the West Coast, kind of
Okay. Time zones. What about internet service providers? Yeah. All of those things come in, and this is where the other class becomes helpful, and it even makes more sense, because now we're talking design issues. Because logically, 2 billion will fit, but now your replication is slow. You're talking about authorization, your global catalog that we talked about earlier. Now you're doing it across everywhere. So we are now going to break up the domain into a logical piece. He's got 1, 2, 3, 4. Kyle's still the overall, overall admin for all 4, and now he can what we call delegate control to the different subdomains. So there's still a reason. Before we had to do it if we had more than 40,000. Now we choose to do it. So when we deal with this here, even in the new part, when we're dealing with the first install, it's still going to be our forest. Okay? So then now we're talking about these are going to be what? These are going to be different trees, right, in the big forest. I mean, it's not a farms. Trees on a farm. You could have different animals. You could go across. Maybe. All right, so we've got our trees. We've got our domains. Nowadays, we're going to see a more, again, a logical choice to do it as opposed to being forced to. Sites. We're going to associate sites typically with locations. What's important about sites? It's another management tool. You can deploy software based on sites. What's that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can break that down even further. But we're using the sites is almost always based on the physical element. So if you have .ca and you open up a new building and you install, let's say 500 PCs, a lot of times when those PCs are joined to the domain, they're automatically going to associate with their local site. So they're going to authenticate locally instead of going all the way up here. Organizational units. This is a big one. You'll see several questions on the test about organizational units. And the word itself, Microsoft actually kind of makes sense with some of these. The term defines typically what it's doing. I'm using a boundary, a package, a unit to organize. And again, we're talking the logical piece, although it's overlapping a physical. I have an organizational unit. What are some of the organizational units I would choose to have? Computers and users. How would we break that down even further? Domain, member servers, security, states, third-party tools, contractors, consulting. Yeah, you can put them in, you can what we call nest them as well. So you can have Idaho, and inside of Idaho, you would have admin, users, contractors. And guess what you have inside of California? Admins, users, and contractors. You want to follow that same structure so that whether I'm in California or Idaho, I have that same piece. Correct. Here's the way I typically think of it. You want to organize your structure into the most reusable unit. If my administrators need a different software installation than my users, put them into 2 different groups, because now you can do that. If I've got support technicians, I have those who are level 1 and those that are level 2. I want to separate them individually. Okay? So when we talk about organizational units, that's what we're dealing with or talking about is units of administration. So in your book, oops. Okay, also we've got, I'll talk the physical. We have our physical controllers. We talked about the global catalog before you got here. Anybody questions on what the global catalog does? What is indexing? Okay, so why would I have, now the place we really see indexing is in database, whether it's Oracle, SQL Server, and in those areas you actually can go through and what you can build procedures, what they call stored procedures, that pre-build those questions. You know that every day Travis says, okay, what were last night's sales? So what you do is at 5 in the morning, it's going to pre-build. There's a procedure that says run previous day sales. So now when he comes in the morning, he doesn't have to wait a half hour. Boom, it's already there. Like a data store we talked about on Monday. So when we talk about the global catalog, that is basically bookmarking all the structure on our network, all the people. So if Josh or Travis have to search for a person or something like that, the global catalog will make that more efficient. What is a RODC? Why do I want a read-only domain controller? Okay, but there's a problem with that too. What problem will I have if okay, so let's do this. I have my primary, and I do have a read-only, and it's basically for load balancing and backup and redundancy. So for my Japan situation, if I don't want them to have to come across the ocean to do their searches, I can do a read-only. If my primary goes down and I only have a read-only, I do have a serious problem. What is that potentially? Or I say the first, what was the word you used? Change. You can't, what if I make changes? You're stuck. So if you're down for 4 hours and you restore, where do you end up? You have 4 hours lost. So that could be a problem. So what is the overall design principle? How many domain controllers do we want at least? Two. Now there's another role that the new domains use, and it's called multi-master. What does multi-master mean? As opposed to a SM, which is a single master. Okay, and the multi-master means they are equal. I make a change on one, the second one will see it. I make a change on two, the first one will see it. That is what we call multi-master. A single master, Josh has to make the change on one, and it is replicated on down. That's the way it used to be. So now everything is a multi-master model, which means I can make a change here, I can make a change there. If this one is busy on the network, guess what? If I make changes, this one will pick up the load. So it's very nice to have the multi-master, but for design purposes, James could still say, I still want a read-only over here just to lighten the load itself. A lot of times you don't have, we just got a server lying around. Let's throw it out there.
So, the main one goes down, have a read-only, bring back up another one, that read-only up to back over.
It gets updated to the master.
It receives it's a one-way replication.
You can restore from it, but it'll be an image of that one.
It'll be based on that last. Yeah, so when you're dealing with the read-onlys, it's just top-down. Yeah. So.
I think what's happening for us, for instance, we have the same ROC in.
Okay.
And for whatever reason, I think the computers, other than our
you can actually, there are what we call 5 master roles, and we'll see those in a minute. And you can actually migrate those from one to another. But the read-onlys aren't going to have those. It's just the multi-master. So any questions are going to be answered with at least 2 domain controllers in the Windows environment. Okay? But read-only can help for as far as design purposes go. So for us, we have to have at least 1 domain controller, which by default, you can't have a domain without a domain controller. Okay, all domain controllers carry a copy, which is always synchronized. Another newer feature, well, the newer versions of server, if I have a user, Josh, and he's got first name, last name, login, address. In the old days, if I changed, let's say that I misspelled Josh's first name, and I went to make the change. In the old days, it would take the whole Josh object and replicate that. Since 2000, it just says, I'm just going to replicate that one attribute or that one piece. So it's much more efficient nowadays as far as replication goes. The domain is the context which the users, computers, and groups are created. So like we said before, if I'm creating computers in California, they're going to be a part of that subdomain or that particular local group. That is your replication boundary. So when we have the 2 billion, if it's all one replication, great, it all gets replicated, but we're talking traffic, we're talking, all these other pieces, which is why design-wise, James is going to say, no, yes, it can be done, but to ease administration and make it more secure, I'm going to have multiple groups. Any domain controller can authenticate and sign in anywhere in the domain, which is why I want to have one in Japan so I don't have to go across the ocean or wherever that bandwidth is. And what's the difference between authentication and authorization? Okay, you are who you say you are, and once I know, what are you then allowed to do? Okay, so are you authorized? Yes. Or are you authenticated? Yes. And then are you allowed that folder or that access? All right. Organizational units. Again, this you'll see several questions dealing with organizational units. The other kind of equal word that goes with organizational units is group policy. I create group policy to assign them to my organizational units. This is my element here. So we've got some, if you see the little folder here, a lot of these folders are going to be the built-in containers. You cannot assign a group policy to a built-in container. So we're going to have our users. Notice there's no folder here. These are some of the pre-built ones. Computers, kiosks. Sometimes in the past, or sometimes you'll see problems, and this will probably be a test question. Somebody joins 5 computers to the domain. They go and look in the computer's container. They're not there. Why not? Could be GPOs. Let's say we haven't even gotten that far yet. Why would they not be here? Why would they go there? The default location is going to be the built-in computer's container. So the answer could be as simple as, well, once they are assigned to the built-in one, then I can move them over here. Yes, but you can't. But you cannot. This one you can assign policies to. You cannot assign policies to that. No, these are built in. These are the ones that are containers, not OUs.
I thought the ones with Apple icon were built.
No. Okay. These are built-in ones.
All of them?
No, the top level. Users, accounts, kiosks. No, okay, I wasn't looking at those at all. Sorry. All I was saying, there's a difference between a built-in container and an organizational unit. I cannot take a group policy object and say secure this built-in container.
Got you.
I have to have a organizational unit that I assign it to. Sorry.
But I thought that computer's one, though, is built in.
It is,
Default computer's built. That's where I'm confused.
and it's an organizational unit, so you can deal with group policy there.
I see. So you're saying someone built a new container called new computer, so what if I not built there?
Correct.
Okay.
So,
See, that blew
no,
my
I'm
mind.
sorry.
That-
No,
I was like,
no, you're good.
Now I'm picking up what you're saying now. Like,
So,
Because they are going to go into computers OU automatically.
correct. So when they ask a question and they're saying, you go look in computers, or I guess you go look in new computers, whichever one it is, they're not there. Why not? Because they would be in another container.
We do not apply group policy to computers OU.
You can.
Right, but we only do it in the other one, so we have computers that do not have group policy applied.
Correct. And you could have computers set up as laptops, mobile, desktops, whatever they are.
And then by geographic.
Yeah, so you can break those down based on that. So group policies are applied to OUs, not containers that are not OUs, if that makes anything. So just, I guess when you see the question on the test, see if they're saying the computers are in a container or in an organizational unit. And they have to be in an OU if they're group policy issues. Now, James can also say when he joins the computer to the domain, he can have it go into the container that he wants to, or into the OU, as opposed to just getting thrown into the repository or wherever the default is.
So how crazy does that get, dude? Like, I mean, obviously you have multiple domain controllers, you have thousands of computers, different locations. How would you specify all of Los Angeles, all of Portland, to go from the respective computers to the respective?
Some of it can be, there are, you know the WMI? Are you familiar with the Windows Management Interface? Basically, WMI is defining a computer based on vendor, hardware, et cetera, software, all those types. It's almost like, you know, when we're dealing with the program in an API, an application programming interface. So if somebody has like a Google app, there's an API that you can access. That is Google saying, here's our code, and this is what we're letting you work with. These particular snippets of code that we're making public, in essence. Microsoft is going to say, here's our API, and we're not letting you see anything, kind of a thing. So when we deal with the WMI, you can actually say, if computers are joined to the domain in a particular time zone, or based on a particular hardware configuration, put them here, or put them there. Or you can say, Tom, Dick, or Harry is the administrator doing it. If they're installed or joined by a person, put them here. If they're joined by a physical building or IP subnet, put them in here too. So you can design that according to however you choose to. You can. And some people just say, I don't care, put it all into just one folder, and then I'm just going to move it and manage it afterwards. It can, for a small, medium, not a big deal. How often are you joining computers to the domain in a, you know, one?
4 to 5 years in there.
Yeah, not very often. But when you're, again, if we're talking tens of thousands of people, and you have 1,000 people, you know, joining the company on a monthly basis, and you have hardware being revolved on a monthly basis, then you're talking, yeah, it's
Could you do it by naming convention?
absolutely. And the naming convention is another design concept. Some people have the personal choice. I like to somehow deal with location, hardware, operating system, maybe even the person or the type of person using it. So if it's a workstation or a laptop, if it's accounting, if it's a building, if it's a floor, all those types.
I just like doing ours is done by location dash last one access.
Yep. Which is good, but
I'm the only one that uses it. So
okay.
essentially, you would know that that was my computer.
Okay.
On the inventory
Okay. And the MAC address, what if you have a computer with two NIC cards?
Government, the answer, but,
Okay.
yeah, I know, I get what you're saying, but it's like, to answer that, I don't know what we would do in that situation.
I mean, would you default to the LAN or to the wireless MAC if it became an issue?
Wireless always is the case.
Yeah. And that's, you could run it, if you're talking the hacker side, people can go in and spoof MAC addresses too. So theoretically, that gets a little interesting. All right, so what you need to realize is there's many different ways. I don't know exactly what the rule is. Some will say a 1090 or a 2080. I like to spend 80% designing and 20% implementing. I like to put most of my eggs into the thinking about how to do it, because then when I do it, it's much easier. And I don't want to just think, next week James is going to deal with this. No, I'm thinking if James leaves in 3 years, 4 years down the road, what am I going to have to deal with? How am I going to have to redo the naming standards?
Well, that was probably my last job is, all four, let's say all five of us worked in IT.
Yeah.
Had our own specialties. Nobody talked. It was all sectioned off, so when they all left, got fired, whatever. There's one guy that left there that I stood there to fight for. Nobody wrote anything down. What they did, it was like not just this information.
Yep.
So naming conventions were all off. I mean, it was garbage.
A lot of the state agencies, at one point, I don't know I'm sure they still enforce it, but the state actually, when they went over to their idaho.gov, if I remember correctly, they required each agency to come up with a manual defining their entire network structure. And that particular structure had to be approved based on the state's naming conventions and the state standards. Yep. And most of them, agencies could choose what they wanted as long as they were acceptable state or federal standards. Now, documentation is great for the person following you. James may say, screw the documentation, I want job security. If nobody else knows how I do things, they can't get rid of me, or they're going to have to pay me more in order to maintain it. And it's unfortunate, but there are people like that. There are people, there's organizations, there's people where they trust the admin so much that it kind of, or they have a bad way of learning how to do it. So you wonder why Tom, Dick, and Harry did ABC. Well, it's because that's what his hacker buddy told him was the best way to do it. And no, it's...
Oh, they had everything that was automated, login, server, admin, everything. So underneath one username, one password.
Nice. Quite the opposite, but yeah. But and that was for real, right? Yeah.
So, no, it's for real. So the issue was is when that person, when the person left, they knew everything. So they left back doors.
Yeah.
So the issue was is you can't go change the password because that's going to break the automated stuff to get it running. So I had to frantically go find everything I could pertaining to that username account.
One of the problems we used to have, if we didn't remember, and Alteris, Riz would do this as well, remote installation services. What is a SID or a SID or a GUID? GUID.
It's a global unique identifier.
Okay, and a SID, security identifier. Now in Windows, and I'm sure it's others, but in Windows, when I would create an image or take a snapshot of a machine, one of the things I would have to do is run a particular tool called sysprep. Sysprep, correct. So I set up the machine. If I did not run sysprep or a comparable tool, if I took a snapshot of that and then said, I want these 5 computers to have that image, what problem did I have? Identical. The SIDs were the same. That globally unique identifier was the same. So we would have to go through, and believe me, if you forgot to do it a couple times, you would soon remember because you'd have to redo it all. Yeah. So you would run sysprep. It wouldn't wipe everything, but it would remove the value of that unique information So when it was imaged, it would now receive its own global unique or your security identifier. So those are some of the little things that
Now, was that new? I mean, that's not new, but I'm saying like back in the day, like days, that you still sysprep back in the day?
Mhm.
Back,
back
I think, wasn't it?
we were using it on XP Pro back in 2000.
I mean, that's when I started sysprepping.
2003 we were using it. I don't.
Prior to that.
Yeah.
2000, they got really pro.
It did. I'm sure in NT as well. I don't remember NT, but I do remember since basically 2000, 2003, that was a big one. Yeah. And we used Alteris, and that was one of the tools we had to make sure we run with sysprep. And we got it set up. We would forget enough that we actually had a script that would automatically run the sysprep before we would do that. All right, so we talk about organizational units. With Windows Server, Windows domains, this is one of the probably top 3 or 4 things you work with ever. This is when you talk to a Windows administrator and you say Active Directory, one of the first things they're going to think of is organizational units. Ease of administration, control, everything. Security, physical boundaries, logical boundaries. This is the reason we many times choose a domain, is because of the organizational unit and its structure. So we talked about the forest, right? We have our forest root. So we have the root. Then we have other trees in that forest. And then we also have our child domains or subdomains, depending on, I use subdomain as opposed to child. You'll see test questions on this because they're going to talk about forests. They're not going to go back to NT when you had a 40,000 limitation object, but they are going to say in many cases you have a datum corp has 5 facilities or 5 campuses, and why would you create a root domain with 5 child domains? Well, part of it is going to be that control. They're going to say, you're in subdomain 1, why can't you go up here? Because by default, you don't trust up. So you'd have to create that trust. Okay? And you can go through and create these authentications so you can actually go. In fact, nowadays, you can actually have people from outside of your domain authenticate. And the term we just used a little while ago was using the, what was the cloud service? Yeah. So with Azure, you can go through and create a relationship for the Azure.
Oh, sure.
Azure.
Yeah, I don't know how to pronounce it.
I've always said Azure, but
I think it's supposed to be some kind of blue thing.
yeah, it's out in that cloud. All right. So in your book, they talk about in organizational units. They're going to talk about those built-in containers, computers, OU. They've got a list of others. The managed service accounts, user containers. There are some of them that are not viewable by default. You guys don't have the page in. Does it say at the top like 2 dash something? No. Go the other way. Yeah. Okay, sorry, go back to the other one you were on. Right. Actually, go back one more. All right. Okay, right in here. So on the right side page, you're going to see, keep going back. Right here. Those bullets there. Those are the built-in as well as the others. Oh. Okay, so mark that. You'll see questions on those in those areas as far as one of the test questions. Why is it that I don't see this particular group? Well, by default, it is hidden. You have to go to the menu option and say View in order to do it, which is the bottom ones here. The lost and found, programs, systems, NTDS quotas. Okay, and you have to go through in the View menu and choose that. Yeah. Well, they're going to say, why is it that you're trying to find a computer that's not, that you know was added to it, and it could be that it was in the lost and found because maybe that SSID had a problem, or it was removed from the domain, or the computer hasn't logged in for some time. So you will see 1 or 2 questions about that. So schema, like I said, you'll see a question or two, not many, because it's not something we deal with a lot, but we did kind of address it. I'll just show you the syntax. So when we get into the objects, right, so we have a class, a schema called a class ID, and within that class ID, we have a subset, which is the user class, and then we said before we have the attributes. I can't tell you what they all are. I don't know what they all are. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. Just that if you have to go through and if you choose to alter the schema yourself because of you want that level of control, that's where the question would come in most likely. And that's going to be, you're going to have, and in that case, we have multi-masters, right? We talked about the domain controllers are equal. However, the schema role or service is only on one of those. So if you're going to make changes to the schema, you have to actually go to that physical domain controller that has a schema attribute. Typically, it will be the root. However, the person before you who was an idiot could have transferred that to another one for whatever reason. Yeah.
So how would you, I know it's probably off topic, but how would you find out?
You would query PowerShell, I believe, has it, where you can do a get, yeah. But I believe, if I remember, you can also go into the domain controller. If you right-click, there's a properties that actually gets into the sub too. Yeah. They can have global, and this is one of the things he was saying, wouldn't I want all my domain controllers to have a global catalog server? Not necessarily. Do I need backup? Yes or no. Do I have a lot of remote sites with slow connections? Maybe I want to put them out there. Similar to the read-only domain controller might be like the global catalog. Yeah. Yeah, and you can actually assign, I don't remember the values, but you can assign weights to the different global catalog servers. So you can say server 1, like a DNS server, you can associate a value with it. Here's the preferred DNS server, and here's a secondary and third. So you can go through and assign values to them too. Yep. But most of us, we're not going to ever even have a second thought about that unless you're what? Taking a test. I've never, beyond labs and test things, I'm aware of it. If I were spending that 80-20 design time, I might think, oh, do I want to move it here or not? Well, no, it's I haven't dealt with, if I were an Intel or a Microsoft, now I have to open up that view. So we can come through here and we can alter this. Just remember that most of the time we're not going to, but you can if you need to design-wise. Okay, new for Active Directory. We have the rollback feature came back a while ago, but now we can go through and roll back not just like we can drivers and so forth. Active Directory, we have our rollback. Let me see in your book. Oh, if you had that one page, if you go to the next, skip over one more page, right there. So when we see the part that says Active Directory Forest, those are the different roles. You have your schema master role, your domain naming master role, the enterprise admins group, the schema admins group. Those are the ones that by default are only in that forest root.
So my students asked me, I couldn't quite answer it, between like the domain admin and enterprise. I know enterprise is above.
It is.
So is enterprise virtually above all the domain controllers, and domain admin is just pretty that specific domain, or how does that work?
It also depends on, if you have one domain, then they're in essence the same thing. You could actually say the enterprise admin is my forest engineer or my forest level admin. Whereas now I can have a domain admin that is only responsible for that child or subdomain. So it depends how you're logically built.
Now, as enterprise, you oversee just servers and not just domains, but just...
The enterprise admin is the god of everything.
Okay, I thought the schema admin was the man,
That is a attribute that can be added to it. The enterprise admin by default has that.
Okay.
But you could say, I want Gary to also be a schema admin so that he can go through and tweak it and alter it if he needs to. But again, beyond test questions, you're not going to have to worry about that because you're enterprise admin, or you're going to have 2 or 3 people that are enterprise admins. Again, Intel, Microsoft, I can't imagine how tight that structure is that high up. In fact, they probably have that like in a disconnected black box network, like CIA Langley type thing as far as some of that goes. Everything can be...
Rogue enterprise admin.
Oh, yeah. I don't chew or smoke, but and it still comes back to me, not last year, the year before, there was a disgruntled employee for Reynolds Tobacco, which makes Copenhagen, Skoal, all those. And this employee was pissed off enough, and apparently what happened is metal shavings got into some of the cans of chew. And there were 8 cans found in 6 Midwestern states. And this is again rumor, but if it's true, this one person got pissed off, put things that should not have been in certain cans, and guess what they had to do? They had to pull everything for 3 or 4 months. Yeah, and they're thinking, yeah, and it took 6 months for some of that stuff to come back in. So you have one pissed off person, hey, they didn't give me my raise, or they didn't do this. You still have to be careful of those things. Everything can be compromised at some point. What is the most secure element or server or service ever? How can you secure something in its total and complete entirety from anything? And okay. Okay. That to me. So you're talking no physical connectivity, possibly no power connectivity in a secure location, but and that to me is about the best you can get. Talking, yes, environment that it's in, but you still have Tom Cruise climbing through the radio, so you can still have somebody that physically can. So then you might say, okay, well, I'm going to put drives over here in separate rooms controlled by, like the whole, you're talking nuclear guys where you have to have, 3 keys in 3 states standing on their head while they're reciting the alphabet inside out, upside down, Japanese, English, German. Once they all do that, then it suddenly. So for the most part, yeah. People are, well, is it secure? What's more secure? Is the credit cards with the chips, or is the swipe? Well, the chips are, but still, if somebody can get to it, somebody can get to it. You have some guy that's smart enough to hack into your system, it can be done.
Sometimes it doesn't have people
A lot of that varies on the piece. The chips, I have customers all the time saying, I hate chips. They're more secure. They're much more secure, but you can.
That's why you just do NFC.
Because then you have to be, but the nice thing about the chip is what happens if somebody scans that chip? They're still going to have a problem. Even if they have the chip, the next transaction is its own unique transaction. And then the one after that is its own unique transaction. Where they're stealing it along the way. That's where you'll see that. But if somebody were to steal your strip, guess what? That's a physical strip. That can be. So you'll see the ATMs or the gas pumps where they have the little plastic boxes and.
Well, you always build something as a security thing. Some of the first engineers, there's always going to do that thing.
The most secure for most of the people most of the time. And still, James could say, well, yeah, but.
I'm worst case scenario. Like you said, concrete coming through.
Yeah.
That's what I would do.
Yeah. And
Put a tacked on.
Cerberos. All right, so those are some of the radioactive. No. It's got 3 heads, 4 feet, and
Or kid or the largest
both.
structure?
They're growing.
Director actually constructing a movable structure because they can't get close enough to it to build it over the thing. So they're building a movable structure that they're going to roll across the top of it because even though so much radiation in the atmosphere, it's still going to kill people, like over the United States or
That was a big one. All right, so Active Directory, we're talking security boundary and replication boundaries. Okay, new for 2012, our snapshot rollback.
Okay, I'm confused by that. The detect event such as snapshot rollback. So does that mean like a snapshot rollback from a virtual computer?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in other words, it's going to detect that if there are some changes made, that it'll be able to put it back like it was before.
In fact, the property that they're talking about in your book is called the generation ID. Yep. So for Windows Hyper-V, it allows a virtual machine to detect events such as a rollback so that so that you're not going to have out-of-date replications. So if you have a domain control that is down and it has your record and a record has been changed, otherwise it knows which one has precedence over the other.
And that's how.
It's comparing it's comparing the timestamp, the attributes, the physical machine, those values into that. I don't know if it's actually that globally unique identifier. No, it wouldn't be because that's hard. No, a lot of that now is actually metadata or XML data. Yep, tag into the tag base. Deployment and upgrade improvements. Before we had to run the ad prep, sysprep, not sysprep, but ad prep. Now we can get into the PowerShell, automate those scripts. We get into our management improvements. One of the things they talk about here, and I had a little question mark, what is auditing in Windows?
How much we're looking at that?
Okay. What does Webster say an audit is? Okay. Make sure that A equals B. And if not, the IRS says, it doesn't matter what your B says, our A says something different. And we supersede or we have control over that. Okay, so when we talk about auditing here, there's 2 times that we can choose to audit. And this is typically your preventative measure or your Band-Aid measure. Am I auditing to see who, what, where, when, why happens in case there's a problem, or have I already had a problem and now I'm starting to audit? The problem with that is if the event's already happened, you've kind of missed the event if you don't have some sort of auditing set up. So here when they talk about auditing, dynamic access control makes it easier to control who can access those resources and audit who has accessed them. We could always audit, but now we're dealing with it more through our Active Directory. Let's see where, control who has that access. We are, there's your virtualization, and your right here. There's your auditing. Under the management improvements. Platform improvements, they talk about the RID pool, your relative identifiers. Basically, if you had so many devices on your network that you ran out of IDs, how would you go back and reclaim some of those IDs? Similar to like IP4 running out and dealing with private networks. So in our 2012 R2, basically that pool is it's not an issue of running out of relative identifiers. I've never had it happen. I've never heard of it happening to anybody, except again the test question. And I guarantee you'll see a test question on the RID pool. Or how would you, talking about the scenario would be you're running 2008 R2 and you have so many devices installed and one of them comes up with this particular error ID. how would you resolve that error? If it was a 2012, you could say it doesn't happen because the new server operating system is able to reclaim those RIDs from before, whereas earlier you'd have to go through and flush and release those. It is very, that would be a very comparable. On a different scale, but that would be a good, yeah. Where if you run out of addresses, yep. RID pool improvements prevent situations in which RID numbers are used or allow more time and run the risk of using all of them.
And the RID numbers at 2 billion, that means that we're going to 140,000 54 now. So yeah, so you're relating to that 2 billion number up there, that's a RID pool?
I would, I'm saying yes, but I am not 100% if that's actually,
No, I mean,
I do.
okay.
It's not, it is a problem we used to have, but it isn't anymore. But a lot of it is because it is managed better. I'll double check on that. So our RID pool, and then your index being able to deal with your schema and update that. Let's go this, I need speed. Workplace join, also in 2000 Active Directory. So this is where we can allow non-domain users to work and access resources. Next page, they have your workplace join. It says, let's see, where did I have that? Okay, both Windows-based and Apple-based devices can be registered on a Windows 2012 R2 domain. The user's personal device can also be registered. So you're talking personal devices in addition to company devices, if you have or want the authority to do that. Nope. So you'll see most likely you see a question on the workplace join. Just know that that's going to be computers or devices outside of my network can now have access to it without having to have separate accounts created. You can secure it through that. That also ties into some of your Azure authentication, where that would be somebody like, I want to use my personal computer at work, and you as an administrator can say, I can give you access to domain resources without having to put your device on the domain. That gets to me in a little bit of a shaky area. To me, how do you control what that computer does or doesn't have on it, or compromise?
Or audit or login.
Sure.
Well, when I was working, like when I was going to Micron to my house, like I could actually do my practice. As far as that, like I could easily just run through it on my own computer because I had to.
But there's a problem with that too. If you have malintent or you install different pieces. So a lot of times we're just going to say, no, you can't do it. You just have to use a company computer. And even then, even a lot of these companies and organizations, they give their staff computers, but they let them install whatever they want to. And that again, you're feeding into that, that similar problem. Oh, nobody's going to do that. I told them in an email not to install that ActiveX control. They know they're not supposed to do that. Solitaire, I removed them off all the machines. There's no way they put them back on. Huh. I like the philosophy, and I use my kids because if they're going to break it, they break it. So for me, I learned from them. That's just because I'm close to that environment. But for me, I like to start secure and ease it up if people behave, if people learn what they're supposed to do. And even then, there's only so far I'll go. Hey, I want to install this tool. Can you do it? No, you can't, but give me the tool that you want, and I will test it, and then I will install it if you need to. And if it doesn't work, then I'll tell you what, you bring in your own laptop and you install it on your piece, but it's not going to be on our network.
And then between that, do they have a boost all the change control from the developer, your SQL database and all for you like that? But then you have one for the rest of the stuff.
Yeah, it's you got to assert yourself, and you will probably have people that aren't happy. Well, the other guy used to let me install whatever I want. We used to have World of Warcraft games at night. How come we can't do that now? That's your test room. All right, so we have our multi-factor. You may see some of that. So basically, several ways to access, control, secure, either through different device types, as well as you can go through and say your multi-factor. If you meet A, B, and C, then you can allow them in to authentication. Mobile, well, yeah, if your name matches, if your group matches, and if all the criteria is met, then I'm going to allow access. Oh, yeah, I'm just. Yeah, I guess we can take a quick break, and then I'll take a quick break, and then I'll come back and finish in the next 20 minutes or so, and then we'll do the lab. So I'd like to have the lab 2 finished. Who already did lab 2? You did? Did you do lab 2? With 2? Have you done that one? Not extra, lab 2. Lab 2 we haven't gotten to yet. He went ahead and was doing some stuff.
Yeah, but Mike has done this before.
Yeah, I have. This one up here, I think they're hard for like
But a long time ago.
over 2 years ago.
And I see kind of like 20 years ago.
My dad
Look, man, we don't need to speak forever.
that's a good point.
Some of this stuff, I'm like, it's so easy. If they were to sit there and tell me this is your goal, do it. But this is probably for someone who's never touched server, ever.
All right, so domain controller. Any questions on what the domain? Oh. Okay, we've talked about the domain controller, the database. Kerberos is our authentication in Windows. Best practices, at least 2 domain controllers. You can use a read-only if you need to, as far as additional security, because it's only a read-only. It's just receiving information, especially at other remote sites. BitLocker, so now we're talking encryption. You can even get into a third-party type authentication process, whether it's a secure ID or some other physical. Radius is an additional. Radius is especially when you're talking outside the organization, trying to access. Yes. Yep. Where you will then authenticate through a Radius server, and it will authenticate through your domain controller, and then allow access. Yep. Those yes, the tokens, absolutely.
Fun fact, 512 bit and below, if you have RSA tokens, make sure they're 1024.
Yep.
It's funny because they were saying that 256K wasn't been button for 10, 15 years.
Oh no, this 512 I think read was button like years ago. Now it's like,
Brute force or how?
you know, I didn't really read on it, so I didn't believe it, to be honest with you. And I was like, crap, we use RSA hardware right now.
Uh-huh.
Are they 10, 24 and above? Or haven't they? I don't know. I'm like, where our data centers protect. So everything
Okay.
is push protection from a good guys probably don't know.
They carry their guns. That's enough security.
Oh, they're those same guys you call from anywhere else to get the prompt. They want to protect the
Yeah. All right.
Wow. That's something else.
How?
Because we cracked the world's toughest encryption by listening to the tiny sounds made by computers.
Really?
And that's the 4096-bit RSA.
That was from the 4096?
Yep.
Actually making noise. Click? Come at me. Well, like, remember TrueCrypt?
Yeah.
That's pretty, that's been cracked. So
Yeah.
the one that I know that hasn't been cracked, that's free bit locker.
Which is the one that offered $1 million if you could crack it?
Well, apparently Supreme Court is getting low-body resolution.
Remember the ones they developed at MIT and the federal government actually told them they couldn't release to the public?
Vaguely.
Without giving them the key until they went into it and never hear of it again.
Of course, because they probably borrowed it.
Yep.
Government probably buy it.
I think they did for this.
Proprietary.
I think they offered to.
Your brain is ours because you know more. With Fred Durst. Yeah, Fred Durst.
I don't know what's worse, spiritual or the singer.
Or if they're,
The same guy?
yeah, father-son,
Oh, God.
dynamic duo. All right, so domain controller. In your book, they're going to talk about installing a domain controller. You do that in the lab or have done it in the lab already. They give you some questions. Are you again, this is the design part. Are you installing a new forest? So are you starting from scratch? Is it a new tree? Is it a subtree? Is it a child domain? What is the name for your domain? What is the level that you're going to deal with as far as the domain goes? Correct. Child forest. Will the domain controller also be a DNS server? Most likely yes, but you can choose not to, as long as there is DNS accessible. Will the domain controller host the global catalog server? By default, the first one installed in the forest will also be a global catalog server, but if you want to, for load balancing, you can have that pushed to others or added to others as well.
Is that something you set up? It's like, kind of like how you set up like the gateway and your DNS point?
Nope.
Or is it auto?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. It'll detect.
You kind of request for it to know.
Correct. And I'm pretty sure even automatically it knows and will seek for the closest global catalog server to it. If that is unavailable, it will take the next step, whether it's the same site, same location, wherever it may be. NetBIOS, we really don't deal with NetBIOS much, at least as far as actively. We kind of that's one of the reasons we have Windows Internet Naming Service in the background. Yeah. You don't need it, but still. All right. Upgrading a domain controller. We talked about upgrading on Monday. Before you upgrade from 2003 to 2012 or 2008 to 2012, whether it's 8 or 8R2, you will want to go and review documentation. Sometimes they will have you, they will make sure that there is that you are not running Exchange on that box, that your global catalog server has to be on a specific domain controller. So there's some of those things that have to be set up correctly if you're going to create a second or if you're going to add to it. Again, research, white papers, those are all going to help you in making sure that you're doing that migration quickly and not necessarily quickly, but easily and correctly with the least amount of overhead. Years past, if I was going to upgrade, there were sometimes dozens and dozens of steps. Make sure this is uninstalled. Make sure you're downloading or you're up to this patch before you do this. And if this is at patch A, make sure this is at patch C. And that this has to be on here. And so there's a lot of steps. The easiest thing, start brand new forest, brand new domain controller. But a lot of times in a new environment, you can't do that. Or in an existing environment, you can't do that. So we still deal with overall design concepts, multiple domain controllers. Here is your global catalog server. Remember we talked about logical, physical. There's the partitions. You've got your schema partition, your configuration partition. Those are the same across the domain controllers. If you have a child or a subdomain, that child domain will have another partition, etc., and so on down. So James is creating subdomains or child domains for replication boundaries and for administrative tasks. He also would need to remember that if he is migrating or accessing, not all domain controllers might have all of that information. They're going to be on different partitions. He can move those partitions if he chooses to, but not necessarily, A won't necessarily have B. This is you can have this link or relationship, but as far as the partitions itself, it would be physically on another box. You will see questions on these different partitions and moving them from domain controller to domain controller. That was on test all the way back to 2000, so that's been in several places throughout. Active Directory sign-in. You're going to have your credentials. We talked about it a little bit. I'm not going to go into detail, but you're authenticated. Once you're authenticated, it knows who you are, then you are allowed access to certain resources. Okay? We're finding the domain controller. It's going to return a ticket back to us saying yes or no. Once you do that, you're then going to access the workstation. Domain controller grants access to that. Based on that, it's then going to access server resources, and then it will return access to the server. In other words, if my computer is turned on and I'm logged in, actually let me step back. When we talked earlier on Monday, we say that there's two basic objects for GPOs. I can deal with a user-assigned object and a computer-assigned object. What will be assigned, or what is the first to be sought after as far as registration goes, the user or the computer? Computer. The user cannot log on to a computer that is not turned on. The computer starts up. It will therefore go through and apply what has to be done based on the computer itself. Once the user then is authenticated, right, and allowed access, the computer has its restrictions, and then Travis will have his additional restrictions on top of that. Okay? And then based on if he is in fact allowed access, he's given the permissions, and then he can then access resources on the server or the network. Service records. Okay, you'll see this on the test too. Guarantee it. You have we talked how Windows 2, right now we're dealing with a multi-master mode. Earlier versions it was single master. These are all of those master operations. It just so happens that now they're replicated across. They are not assigned to one computer. Operations master, single master, and you're flexible, FSMO. This is also new 2012. I don't think 2003. I'm trying to remember. I think 2008, yes. You will need to know these 5, so mark those. You'll see test questions on these. The Forest has 2 of them, the domain naming master and the schema master. In other words, if I'm going to create a new domain, I can't just pick any domain controller. It has to have that particular operation on it. And then within the domain, we have our RID master that's going to assign relative identifiers, which means a computer, when it is assigned to the network, part of that ID is going to say the domain. So it is unique to that child element right here, the RID master. Your infrastructure master, and then your emulator, which goes back to your primary domain controller, kind of your read-only part. So if we're over here, so I've got my Forest, intel.local. I also have a child of California and a child of Idaho. If we go back to the board, the Forest is going to be a part of all of these. The domain, so these 3 options here, or operations here, California will have its 3 version for the California domain. Idaho will also have its 3 operations for the Idaho domain. So the domain level ones, you could have several masters for each domain. The forest is just going to have the 2. Okay? You will see that on the test. I'll bet pizza on that. Good pizza. Okay, so and we'll go through on the lab there. Or you'll see those in the lab, so we won't do that part. Doing it from Server Manager, you can also do it from the PowerShell. We're going to add a domain controller to an existing, add a new domain to an existing forest, or add a new forest. Any questions on those 3 options? Is it new? Am I creating a new child? In other words, I've got Intel. Am I now, for the second option is going to be, am I now creating a California? Am I creating an Idaho? The first option here is, am I adding something to California? Am I adding a domain controller to Idaho? So you get those 3 options. Based on what you're choosing, whether it's new, existing, or a new DC, you would then obviously select what you want. And then you have to provide, of course, your enterprise or domain. If you're dealing with the forest, you have to be an enterprise admin. If James delegated you control over your domain, you'd have to be a domain administrator. Server core, basically the things we just saw, now we're doing through PowerShell. So you just have to know the syntax. How often are you going to add a domain controller to your domain? Guarantee not very often at all. It is good experience, but in the real world, very rarely are you going to have to do that. But when you do have to do it, obviously that's one of the most important parts of your network. You have to do it right.
That's what I liked about 16 and 10. Right off the get-go, they're secure and locked down until you get all going on.
This should begin to look familiar as far as PowerShell, right? We saw those. So you've got your install dash, your features, and what am I going to install? I'm going to install that. And again, you have to know the syntax. If you don't use the auto syntax option, which I recommend, this is where, and I've said it several times, the standard, not requirement, is to cap.
So you don't
Cap.
have to, because when it's telling us to type that stuff in, it's just like that.
No.
Notice when typing, not when I'm trying to build a script, but if I want to install ADDS,
No.
AD doesn't have to be capped.
No. In fact, when I see that, there's still times I'm like, I'm just going to make sure that I don't have to capitalize it. And so I'll try, oh, yeah, it runs. And sometimes it will come back with an error, and it's usually me typing it wrong, not that I haven't capped it. But still, unless you're a developer or a coder, the caps isn't going to make sense to you. Why do I capitalize it? Oh, it looks different. Yeah, but I don't care about that. But when you're trying to debug and find a problem, I guarantee these capitals are going to help. Now, one line of code, no. How often are we dealing with one? No, we're dealing sometimes hundreds. How long is a script? Scripts can be a couple lines, or they can be many, many, many. Yeah, subscripts, make scripting calls, procedure calls. Go back to the Jurassic Park, Newman. How can you debug 2 million lines of code? Imagine 2 million lines with no sort of help dealing with any of those. So I don't know if I never saw that. I don't know that you would see a question as far as do you have to or not. I don't ever remember seeing answers that give you the same answer. One is caps, one isn't, but they're identical. So I've never had to see that. If they gave you 2 options that were identical, one capped, one wasn't, choose the capped one. Upgrading a domain controller. For the Windows where? For the Windows remote management? Yeah, for the PowerShell, doing it remotely.
If you right click on like a server in Hyper-V, you can actually execute PowerShell right there.
Oh, okay, I got you.
Or on desktop.
Yeah, or we did it yesterday in computer management. It's the same thing, but this is,
My favorite tool on the planet.
well, it is, unless you'll probably learn to love PowerShell, so you're going to start coding everything. So you can pass that test. So upgrading, you need to know what you're starting in, where you're going to go to. We just said it. Research. Microsoft white papers are going to be a tremendous help. Benefits of upgrading, except for the checks, files, programs. I have learned over the last 20 years that nothing is ever absolute. It is always, it could, it should, it probably will. Hey, is this going to happen? That's the way it should work. Never, yes, it will. You always, and if you don't use those words, I guarantee at some point somebody will call you on it. You'll get in trouble, and you'll have to say, "Okay, yes, yes."
But see, my thing though is stuff like we were talking about yesterday. You have stuff probably mapped to your 08 OS.
Mm-hmm.
That might not be compatible with 2012, but if there's stuff running to that, that remember pictures is great stuff.
It can.
So what, I mean, common sense to say, hey, let's do a test environment.
Absolutely, and that's just practical, not even common sense. I mean, it is common sense, but yes. So one of the things, if we go back to the early Windows, right? If you wanted to print in Word, you had to install the print driver for Word, print driver for Excel. Coding has changed over the years, and the idea now is I have namespaces that I reference. I'm going to create a snippet of code here, and I'm going to have everybody, every tool or application within Windows point to this. And if I have to change a location or a value or an attribute, I don't have to go around here. As long as this is changed correctly, all of this, there's that word, should function correctly. Correct. So when we are dealing with an upgrade from one version to another, when we're dealing with especially paths and locations, those things should change correctly when you're going from 2008 to 2016. But there always is a chance that it's going to break. More often or not, the problems you have are going to be with third-party software and tools and even your own custom proprietary tools. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Or you prefer job security. But those are all discussions when you're in your groups and you're having all your meetings. You're going to say, well, this proprietary tool, oh, I really love because it does ABC. Yeah, but you don't realize where it hurts us in DEF. Or in 3 years, what about CDE? Those things. So really the question, and here's that thing right here. The risk, those legacy files, domain DLLs. What's a DLL? Link library. DLL, in PowerShell, remember they have the commandlets, which are basically pre-built operations. And you access commandlet install, and it will do blah, blah, blah. DLLs are basically, it is a compressed, non-executable application, if you had to kind of say what it is. So the concept is similar to what I said. You're going to have a DLL for the printer, not a DLL for Word printer, Excel printer. DLLs are not things that you typically want to say right-click, delete, and let's see what happens. Or go ahead and try it, and I guarantee there will be some issues.
So the DLL is like line static code that can be accessed as needed, and INI is like settings that are customizable and savable that you still use to pull into the program, and that's how the program works.
Okay?
It pulls different parts together.
Sure. And what about an EXE?
That's an executable, which is generally the command that initiates the whole thing that the rest of it plug into.
Okay. Now, if you've ever worked in Visual Basic, when you build a program, you can what we call compile it into an executable file. And there is something very specific about, what's that? They are, but they're not an executable in the sense of me executing it. However, an executable does something that is extremely important that we cannot do without, some sort of an install type program. It registers those DLLs with your system, and it is supposed to register them in the right locations where you create them. So when you install a program, many times you can't just say, here's the tool. You have to go to the computer and say, let me run the exe, so it puts the stuff in the right area, and it registers all those components, and it registers those DLLs with your system, your particular system. When you deal with your hackers, and who has seen this? I'll just ask. How often have you seen a message that says, if you're having problems with this program, take this DLL, rename it to this, and put it in this folder and delete the old one, and your program should be working just fine after that. Has everybody seen that at some point? Okay, there's a danger to that, because that DLL is basically an application, and we don't know what other instructions are in there. It may operate just fine. It could have a worm in it. It could have some sort of a timestamp. When something happens, that's where it goes. So be careful with DLLs. Yes.
What would you use to open up?
If you have a programming utility like a Visual Basic or a C#, most of the time you can search for a decompiler program. Sometimes text editors, if they're robust enough, you can right-click text edit. Which one? Yeah, there's some what's not good about Notepad. What you do want to get is a text editor that gives you the color coding and the other assistance, unless you, like the PowerShell ISE. Yep. All right, so upgrading a domain controller, you will see a few questions on the design parts here. Are you going to upgrade in this scenario? So-and-so is trying to upgrade. You want to look for parts of the question that say new forest, existing forest, child domain. Am I installing it in a new location? Those kind of things. So remember how you read the question. IFM, install from media. What this basically is saying, and I use the example, I think, Monday. If I want to send that domain controller to Japan, many times what I will do is I will create the domain controller on my network in California, let it replicate, send it to Japan, and then when it's brought online, it's just going to replicate the changes from the last 2 days. What we're doing here with the IFM is, instead of replicating the whole path or the whole database, we are giving it a file to get those to get the existing changes from. So instead of replicating from another domain controller, is that a sneeze? Bless you. Instead of replicating from another domain controller, we're saying, I want you to replicate this file that has the most updated information. So it's going to save on network traffic. However, you have to remember there's changes since that file's been created. Is it worth that cost or not? But that's the IFM. Never saw a test question on it. Doesn't mean it wouldn't be there. But you do want to know the options. Build it, let it replicate. Build it, let it replicate from a remote site. Do I want it to actually just replicate off of a file that's been updated relatively recently? But there's a lot of non-logical people. Yes. So knowing how to, and you don't even have to dumb it down, you just have to, the test questions can definitely point you in a certain way based on the keywords that you see. You want to look for those keywords, and they'll start to stick out to you. Azure, the Active Directory, we did talk about this. Read about it in your book. You'll see a question. You probably will see a question on that, where we're now basically talking cloud access. So you have your domain controller on your local network. It can actually sync. So instead of your Active Directory directory service, you basically now have Azure Active Directory.
So basically, you're running secondary domain controller if you have one.
It would, the idea would be a child domain, but we're talking in the cloud. So now we can replicate with those. What are Azure apps? Third-party apps, probably. Some of them are pre-built. Microsoft buys them, builds them. You're going to pay Microsoft a lot of money to develop your own cloud solution, kind of a thing. That's that. Office 365. When I log into Office 365, I don't want to say, yeah, I'm going to use Kyle at Gmail for this, but my regular work computer is going to be Kyle at Intel. You're going to say, I want Kyle at Intel, and I want it to replicate those things. The idea being, if I change Kyle's phone number here, if he's at home logging onto his Office 365 through the cloud, that phone number should automatically be synchronized and replicate over here. If I am doing it that correctly. Yes. Now, the idea, one of the big reasons for Active Directory domain services is removing redundancy. How often does somebody build an app? Oh, this is great. It keeps track of all of our maintenance records. And that person really likes it and uses it, and it's just on an access database. Simple thing, it's in this computer. In fact, this happened out at Mountain Home. One of the coders there, they reformatted somebody's computer because they had been gone for a year. But guess what was on that computer? All of a sudden, they came into work on Monday, and they couldn't see their data. Well, what happened? Oh, it's down. And the guy said they took days and days and days. They paid people hundreds of dollars to figure it out. And what it was, they hadn't actually reformatted the computer, but it had been turned off and unplugged and put in a closet for storage. And they had no idea. All they knew is I opened up this application and I see all the data and I make changes. They had no idea that so-and-so built it years before and it was stuck back there.
I've seen that at least a dozen times.
Yeah.
In small companies, one of the metal shops here in Boise was that had an access database where they used to look at their work diagrams that they built. Old programs kept saying, this is something we can't afford to get a new one.
Yeah.
Or something like that, and some guy got a new computer.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden the whole shop was down for like a week.
So when we're talking these databases, we're talking they're what we call relational databases, as opposed to a flat file, which is Excel. Okay? SQL Server is Microsoft's big relational one.
I refer to Excel as a funky file.
It works, but it's all right. So there's your Azure directory deploying domain controllers. 2012 is already able to go there. We obviously know virtualization and Hyper-V do work there. Some of the things to worry about, physical resources, bandwidth resources, visualization considerations, your synchronization, single point of failure. Nothing, I think, too new there. Thank you. All right. Yeah. Yeah, we're going. Whew. If you want to watch it on Facebook. All right. You'll see quite a bit on the test. And you will see, if you take the next two tests, you will see this stuff on those tests as well. If you do the other classes, especially the Active Directory Design class, some of that will help you in this test too. They say you don't have to take the other classes to know this, but it will definitely help in seeing the big picture and answering some of the questions.
So you're going to do it to get rid of redundancy at the beginning, take 3 classes with redundancy.
Do as I say, not as I do. This is not classroom layout material. This is the real life domain material. But yeah, there's... The which one? They're after this. As soon as this class is over, then is the 11, and then after that's over the 12. I'm doing the 3 of them. Yeah, it's not next week. It's the Monday after. So we have this week, next week.
The end of March 15th might have 20 weeks that is divided by 3.
Yeah, without the Fridays.
So that I might be able to provide.
Yeah, so you're talking the next 6
And
weeks.
the evening class.
Same time, same bat channel,
That is awesome.
all days except Fridays.
Yeah, Josh and I are actually partying afterwards.
Are you doing all three? Are you too? You are?
If I can.
What's up, Greg? Come on.
Like I said,
We'll even let you buy pizza in the second class.